Financial advisors help Australians live better lives, and we're great at it. But what about us? For us to thrive in the coming years, I'm here to ask a very big question. How can we live better, run better businesses, and help more clients along the way? My name is Jessica Brady, and I would love for you to join me as I listen and learn from experts who answer these very big questions. I am lucky enough to record most of my podcasts on Gadigal land.
Zurich is the proud partner supporting this episode. As one of Australia's largest life insurers, Zurich encourages the promotion of positive conversations leading to a more sustainable future for life insurance, committed to championing financial advice through education and research-led market insights.
This week in Australia, we celebrated International Women's Day, and the theme for International Women's Day this year was Break the Bias. So I thought it was time for us inside financial services to talk about something that hasn't really got a lot of airtime, and that's financial abuse, specifically gender-based financial abuse. As you can imagine, this is a pretty heavy topic, but an important one, so please don't shy away from listening. I obviously need to issue a bit of a trigger warning because we are discussing specifically gender-based violence today and domestic violence in general. I am delighted, though, that I got to interview the highly respected Moo Baulch. She is a social justice and gender equality leader in Australia and has a career-long commitment to addressing and preventing violence against women and LGBTIQ+ people. She worked with the Commonwealth Bank to help develop the Commbank's trauma-informed community wellbeing team, and currently works as the Director of Primary Prevention at the Women and Girls Emergency Centre in Sydney. I think you'll agree today is a big but very important conversation, and Moo helps us understand how we as financial services professionals can help. Well, hello and welcome, Moo. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Absolute pleasure, Jess. Lovely to be here.
I want to say from the very beginning of today's conversation that this is a really big, complicated, and heavy topic. And so I probably need to issue a trigger warning that we are today talking about things like domestic violence and gender-based violence. And so, of course, if this brings up anything for you, please make sure that you reach out to a professional. But it is an important conversation, especially off the back of International Women's Day. I felt that it was really important to have a conversation that I feel isn't happening nearly enough in the financial sphere. And I want to focus on domestic violence, specifically around financial abuse, gender-based financial abuse, and how we as the professional financial advice community of Australia can learn more, can understand more, can identify more, and of course, see what we can do to help break this terrible cycle. There is no one better to talk about all of these complicated problems, I don't think, in Australia than you, Moo. So to give everyone a bit more of an understanding, would you mind sharing a little bit more about you?
For sure. Yeah, look, I would say firstly, thank you so much for having me. I'm joining you from Gadigal land this morning and paying my respects to elders past and present and any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander listeners that you have in your podcast. I'm so excited to be talking about this. I have worked in all sorts of parts of the domestic and family violence and violence prevention sector for more than a couple of decades now. And I think the energy and the enthusiasm and the will in the community to start to shift some of the horrific statistics that we see and hear about almost daily, it has never been stronger. So it's a really exciting time to be talking about financial abuse specifically. It's something that we haven't talked about in Australia up until probably 5 or 6 years ago. And yeah, I'm just delighted to be here. Thank you.
Yay. So can we learn more about specifically what you do now? And then I'd actually love to sometimes I feel like we live in a very privileged prism in financial advice because, frankly, the people that come to see us are the people that can afford financial advice, and that is often a very small population of Australians. I'd love to learn more about what are you and your team seeing every day in the work that you do.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm very privileged also to wear a number of hats. So 3 days a week, I come to Women's and Girls Emergency Centre, which is based in Redfern. That's where our head office is. We have a number of refuges and transitional accommodation. So the accommodation that women and kids go into after they've kind of left that crisis space. And we also do a whole range of other things at Women's and Girls, or WAGEC, as we're known. So we do a lot of community engagement. My role here is Director of Primary Prevention. And what that means in, layperson's language is really connecting to community, having conversations with people like you, Jess, talking to people in, the communities around inner city Sydney and inner west of Sydney, but also having conversations with corporates, small businesses, any kind of community network. So we do a lot with local government as well. And we talk about things like how we can all be better bystanders, how we can approach and have a conversation with somebody if we're concerned about them, if we think something's going on in their relationship. So teaching some of those really simple skills to give people the confidence to be able to spot abuse, because it's happening all around us in every across every demographic in every single postcode in Australia. So whilst you might be working in your day-to-day as financial advisors with people in the kind of upper echelons of financial privilege, we know that women, generally women and some men as well, are often, they may have lots and lots of money on paper. They may have be living to all extents and purposes a beautiful lifestyle, but actually they might be living with absolutely no access to their joint bank accounts or their funds. They may be being financially abused in a whole range of ways, and it's often much harder to talk about those sorts of coercive behaviours where somebody's being abused in quite subtle and hidden ways, and that's the conversation that we've only really just started to have in the last few years in Australia.
I think that is such an important point, because we like to believe that domestic violence in Australia doesn't happen. Firstly, I think that there is sort of, if you don't live in it day to day, you just assume that no one does, and yet all the stats tell us otherwise. And you do assume that people in a higher socioeconomic standard of living are not affected by it, but we know that is simply not true, correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And it's so timely that we're recording this podcast today in late Feb, because I was really privileged. One of my other hats is providing advice to the Commonwealth Bank on their financial abuse responses and prevention. And so yesterday morning we had a beautiful launch of a couple of things, actually, one of which is another podcast done by Future Women, which I'd really encourage people to check out. They're releasing an episode a week, and it's centered around the voices of victim survivors. So the voices that often you don't hear. But also we launched a report by Deloitte. So this is the first time that anybody has tried to quantify the direct cost of financial abuse in Australia. And what they did was they took some slices of research, and they have found that the direct cost of financial abuse in 2020, so in a 12-month period, is a staggering $5.7 billion in Australia, with an estimated cost to the economy of $5.2 billion. So 600,000 people over 18 years old in Australia last year were subjected to financial abuse. Sorry, in 2020.
Sorry, just to pause on that, because I think we have to.
Yeah, it's a big number, right?
Yes, it is. It is, and I feel that needs its own sort of pause and reflection. 600,000 people in the 12 months prior to that report sort of data being launched were suffering actively from financial abuse. Absolutely.
We've never had that kind of number before. We've never really been able to quantify it in that way. Part of the problem, I think, in our space is, we have some pretty shocking statistics. We know that 1 in 4 women will experience physical or sexual violence in their lifetime. We know that 1 in 13 men will experience some form of intimate partner violence as well. We've all heard the statistic of a woman a week dying. And that stuff makes headlines now, Jess. That's my reflection as somebody who's been around in this space for a while now, is that those sorts of numbers were not even available a decade ago. However, we have to be careful to think that behind all of those numbers, behind every single one of those 600,000 people is an incredibly complex story, often of extreme power and control. And so the financial abuse is often a part of all sorts of other types of abuse that are going on. Often not physical abuse. Many of these people will completely fly under the radar. There will be no, calls to the police because there's no physical violence. There will be no, reaching out to a service like WAGEC for support because, many people don't reach out to those services and supports for a whole range of reasons. So there's a lot of hidden abuse going on, often that people don't even recognise is happening because of the context in which we're having this conversation.
Then we can only assume that 600,000 is the minimum number of people that have been affected by financial abuse in Australia. And the number could be, hopefully not, but it could be significantly worse. Moo, I listened to you speak on another podcast and you said something that made me stop in my tracks. And I want to just talk about, it's a two-part question, I think. My question, once I tell you the quote, is why? And then the second part is, why do you think financial abuse as a category has been left out for so long? I'm very happy and delighted that we're starting to talk about it, but I'm keen for your expert thoughts on why it hasn't been a conversation to now. But what you said when you were being interviewed is violence is at the heart of Australian culture.
Well, that's a massive question. We could probably talk for hours about that. I think when you consider where Australia has come from in the sense of as a modern country, certainly post-colonial Australia or Australia since colonisation, it's been built on pretty rough and extreme circumstances for lots and lots of people, particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but also a whole range of other people in Australia, and particularly women. I really firmly believe that we have a particular set of circumstances in Australia that support gender inequality and have done for a very long time. So while we've seen advances in other countries and a real challenging of some of the conditions that sit around gender inequality, I think we've got a way to go here in Australia. Having said that, we've also got some really smart people working on it here, which is exciting. And so things like Our Watch, which is the National Prevention Foundation, have sprung up in the last 5 or 10 years. We have a national plan to reduce violence against women and their children, which is ending this year. And there are negotiations, and there's a draft actually that the Commonwealth is closing comments on today in terms of setting the direction for the next 10 years. And financial abuse is named in that. It wasn't a thing that existed as a concept in the plan, in the current plan that's been running for the last 12 years. So we've got some systems and structures to start challenging some of the really, the underlying things that allow this inequality for women to exist and be supported.
Sure. And why do you think financial abuse has for so long not been part of the narrative when we talk about domestic violence or gender-based violence in Australia?
A couple of reasons, I think. I think partly because for so long, domestic violence was just the business of women's services, so women's frontline, feminist services, refuges, those sorts of things, and nobody wanted to listen to what was going on. Partly because it was considered a private, hidden family matter, and that has shifted significantly. And the media, I think, in Australia has played a really big part in that. Victim survivor advocates have also played a massive part in that as well. And it's been actually a really beautiful partnership of journalists, usually female journalists, saying, actually, we're going to tell this story differently. And we're going to recognize that, when another child is killed by their father as a revenge act to try and get back at mum, or when a woman is killed by her ex-partner, it's not just a one-off incident. It's not just a thing that happens and that's terrible. It's actually part of a much bigger social and cultural problem. And we have in Australia a whole lot of attitudes that are widely held in the community that support or excuse violence.
The stats in Australia today are something like 80% of financial advisors are men. I think the average age of a financial advisor is 55 to 58. and I don't have the stats, but I'm going to make this up, I would say between 80 to 90% of financial advisors in Australia today are probably white, heteronormative, cisgendered men. And so this is a whole new big conversation that they may not have ever had to think about having before. But I think it's important to say that you've had if you've been giving advice for a long time, you have had clients that have been the victim of domestic violence. You have had clients, more than likely, that have been a victim of financial violence. Can we talk about red flags? Can we talk about things that we should be looking for and what to do if we suspect there is domestic violence of any kind in a client base or a client couple that we have?
Yeah. I mean, and I guess some of the things we're going to talk about now also apply to your broader life, right? Because we know this is not just happening in people's workplaces and with clients. We also know it's happening to people's siblings, to people's parents, now that we've kind of blown the lid on the size of this problem, and we've started talking about it in a much more sophisticated and nuanced way, we now know that actually it's everybody's business to try and resolve this. So it's no longer just the business of women's services and the police, which was the way it was for a really long time. Sure. So some of the things that are probably that may be red flags, some of the things that you may see or witness would be if a person feels really, if they look as if they're quite isolated, they may be cut off from friends and family, and that might be a long, slow process, which is really quite deliberate. So isolating somebody from their support networks, sometimes from, their religious or cultural connections. So it might be preventing them from going to church or going to the mosque. It might be stopping them from participating in things like Mardi Gras. For some people. If you see somebody who appears to be walking on eggshells, so there's that fear, coercive control is all about creating and then maintaining a level of fear. And so it might not ever be fear of, physical violence. And this is one of the things that I think we need to, keep chipping away at, that the myth that domestic violence results in physical injuries and broken bones. For many, many victim survivors of violence, they say there was never any actual physical violence. It was the threat to, take me to the family court and take away my children. It was those sorts of things that I knew that he would pursue to, as far as he could, because he didn't want to lose that grip of power and control that he had over me. It might be that she's not allowed to do things, or so it might be that she's not allowed to participate in the workforce or study, to be able to have those kind of connections to the outside, and also to be able to have financial independence as well, particularly where you have clients who might be, pretty lucrative on paper. There might be 6 or 7 cars in the driveway, multiple bedrooms in their house. They may have lovely country properties, but if she's not allowed to make decisions about the joint finances, if she's being potentially coerced into, taking out loans or signing up for things which she has no control over or no knowledge about what those impacts might be, that's certainly a sign of financial abuse. She might also look a bit overly anxious to please as well. And so I think there's a real structural piece in here around, women traditionally have not had access to the same type of information and education around financial things. And I count myself as one of those people. I don't think I'm particularly financially literate, but I've understood a lot more kind of having worked in this space, particularly with the last few years with banks, because I think there is some structural stuff, there's some extra care that we can take with people, with clients, where, whether when you're talking to a client, whether they kind of get what you're talking about or not. So making sure that they are walking into those joint decisions, really understanding what the implications might be, down the track if things do go wrong. And then I guess in terms of knowing what to do next, so somebody may disclose to you or they may not disclose to you. If someone does disclose to you, you may be the first person that they've ever had that conversation with. So just making sure that you're really careful around that. And there can be a whole range of reasons why they haven't disclosed to, somebody they know. It might be the only time that they've actually been in a space one-on-one with another person. They may not be allowed to go out and do other things. So just really actively listening, being as non-judgmental as you can, reassuring them that you will try and find them some help and support. Respecting their decisions, because we know that for many victim survivors of violence, it takes a really long time to leave, and there are lots of complexities around why that happens. So not judging when somebody says, I'm going back to that relationship again, just understanding that there may be some really complex safety reasons around why that is, why she's going back to that, often quite horrific abuse. And that can be really hard if it's a friend or a family member. So if it's somebody that you care about a lot, letting them make the choices and really lead what that looks like for them is a tough one. And finally, also just taking care of yourself a bit as well. So if you are a support person, either in a client relationship, or if you're a support person in that more personal sense, just making sure that you have things around you that maintain your safety and also your mental health and well-being, because it can be really hard to hear about some of this stuff, whether you're personally connected to that individual or not.
When I was doing research on financial abuse, because one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about this was I don't know a lot about financial abuse in Australia, and I'm shockingly embarrassed to say that as someone who cares deeply about financial advice and financial literacy for Australians, particularly women, and identifying as a female. I wanted to learn more, which is why I wanted to have this conversation today. So when I looked into it, one of the things that came out immediately as sort of a red flag, if you like, around financial abuse was that the financial abuser will, and I'm using inverted commas here, take care of the finances. And that just resonated so deeply with me, because for so many of us who are financial advisors, there are so many situations where one person will be the dominant sort of relationship contact or decision maker. And it just really reminded me that, sure, there might be a natural inclination to be more interested in the financial world, but I think we as financial advisors have a responsibility to make sure that in couples, both of them regularly and consistently turn up to meetings, postponing or cancelling meetings, or having separate meetings with the other person that wasn't able to turn up potentially unexpectedly on the day. Because even if the person says, I'm going to go back and relay it, or we've talked about it and I'm confident that this is the strategy, we're potentially not identifying a red flag there and or helping people learn more about financial literacy. And what we know in Australia is that, and Moo, take comfort, on average, when you look at it through a gendered lens, men feel more competent about managing the money. They feel more confident about managing the money. But actually, when you look at, and there was industry research done on this a few years ago, women pale in comparison when it comes to the confidence piece, but they are just as competent. And so we've got so much myth busting to do to say to women who might say, I don't understand it. I don't really get it. And what they do is they create this self-fulfilling prophecy where they lean further and further out, and then the men lean further and further in. And then we do end up with situations where they do take more control. And that to me is just the canary in the coal mine that is helping perpetuate these problems.
It's such a good call, Jess, because I think there's two parts to that, right? So there's the piece around prevention, which is, kind of where it's at now, right? We have spent sort of 40, 50 years building really strong women's crisis service responses. But actually what we've recognised here in Australia and in other countries is it's no good just doing that constant crisis piece all of the time. We have to put an equal importance, and that's why I'm really privileged to have this role here at WAGEC, is on the prevention piece. And so that's having conversations with your kids from the earliest ages that are all about framing gender equality for them. Because if you start breaking down those stereotypes from when they're, and I can say this because I've got an 18-month-old and a 5-year-old, if you start having these conversations with them now, then you are setting them up much better to have that level of confidence to be able to ask the right questions or connect to the right places to get the information, which is what we've, traditionally, historically, we've done that for boys always, right? And that's how the boys' club kind of manages to perpetuate itself. So there's the prevention piece. There's also the piece around, you have unique opportunities to have conversations with couples, and sometimes that will be, both people together, and sometimes that will be both people separately. But because financial abuse is something that is really not understood, and it's not part of the kind of mainstream conversation around domestic violence, intimate partner violence, gender-based violence, there's also that kind of responsibility to go, where can we take that extra care? Where can we have those conversations in a different way that actually raise awareness for people who are potentially experiencing this, and making sure that, if somebody does disclose, which they may, it may be that you say something to them and it suddenly triggers, a thought pattern or a series of kind of inner revelations around what's going on for them, and you may be the person that they reach out to. It may be that in the financial sense, that's the easiest way that they can understand what's going on in terms of that misuse of power and control. So just making sure that you're equipped to be able to point them in the right direction, because we don't need to make all of you domestic and family violence experts. You don't need to be specialists in this stuff. It's having a bit of empathy, it's having a bit of understanding, it's being able to use your professional skills to really guide people in the right direction to get that help where they need it.
And that's what we do every day with a financial lens on, and we can absolutely adapt that to make sure that we can help them in another way as well. Moo, what if you suspect it? What if you suspect it but they haven't outwardly said anything?
It's a really tough one, because you may be messing with somebody's safety fundamentally. So I think when it's a friend or a family member or a colleague, it's easier to make a judgment around those circumstances to say, look, I'm worried about you. Your behaviour's changed. You've stopped turning up to family events. I'm concerned. Is everything okay? Or, I heard the way that my brother-in-law was speaking to you. That's not cool. To have that kind of that more gentle conversation, and recognise that they may or may not be ready to talk to you and have, that kind of intimate level of conversation with you. If you see it in a workplace, certainly workplaces, I think, have come a really long way in terms of starting to have quite strong responses and support structures for victim survivors of violence. So a number of workplaces now have paid domestic violence leave. Some have unlimited paid domestic violence leave. Some have leave that you can access to be able to support, a family member or somebody really close to you who's going through the process of extricating themselves from domestic violence. So we are seeing a real shift in that space in terms of the role of business and industry to be able to support their workforces and people within their workforces. If it's a customer or a client, I would say it's very dependent on the relationship that you have with them. Probably being aware that most banks now, or most financial institutions have, that extra care team or role somewhere within them. So recognizing that that might be the most appropriate place to kind of point them in the direction of, if it's looking, purely financial. But also being aware, of course, of 1-800-RESPECT, which is the National Sexual Assault and Domestic and Family Violence counselling service. It's 24/7. It's confidential. Anybody can ring that. So if you, for example, were to sit down with one of your clients this afternoon and you think there's something going on and you're not quite sure how to approach it, I would say to you, Jess, pick up the phone, call 1-800-RESPECT, talk it through with them. They can kind of workshop it with you and work out what the safest way might be to intervene, depending on the circumstances, depending on your relationship with them, because just naming it might be a dangerous thing to do. It may increase the risk for that person.
Yeah, wow. It's interesting because I have had a situation where I suspected something may not be 100%. And I called that person at a later time and said, are you safe? Are you okay? Do you need help? And I didn't quite know what to do thereafter, because it is, it's a situation that we don't get taught really anything about, and you have to go and do your own research. So that number again, just so that, is it 1-800-RESPECT?
So it's 1-800-RESPECT, 1-800-737-732, and you can call that anytime from anywhere in Australia. It's the National Sexual Assault and Domestic and Family Violence Counselling Service. So you can also pass that number on to clients if it's safe to do so. You could stick it on the bottom of your email header. There's a whole range of different places that that number is fairly widely known now. It sounds to me, Jess, as if you did absolutely the right thing. A lot of the time, as I said, we're not trying to set you up to be expert responders in this space. That's not your job. And a lot of this is about being human and having empathy and just assessing in the situation. If you're concerned about somebody and you can have that conversation, separate from the partner, obviously never, ever have the name that kind of stuff when both of them are in the room together in front of you. But yeah, and sometimes the woman will say, yeah, actually, thank you for reaching out. Other times, there may be complete denial, but knowing that you have done everything you can in that set of circumstances, and actually that might be the trigger that gets her to go away and think about it and reach out to a support service like 1-800-RESPECT or elsewhere, or a bank or a financial institution as well. So there's a range of ways that we can all sort of be part of this solution.
Yeah, and it's been interesting because to get you to talk to me today, I'd just been thinking about the lens of our clients or our members, but as you were talking, it's so obvious that we need to think about this as humans who live in communities and employers. So one of the things that we did at Fox & Hare recently is we added, I'm sure, and this is a funny thing as an employer, like it was in my brain and just never formalized. So we formalized domestic leave in our employee handbook, and we made our staff aware of what domestic leave is when you work at Fox & Hare. And I hope that no one ever needs to use it, but I also want them to know that I absolutely want them to use it if they need to. But that's a very simple thing that we, as often small business owners in Australia running financial advice businesses, should take the effort to do, to formalize it, to document it, and actually to sit down with our staff members and explain what it is and what you should be using it and when you should be using it for.
Yeah, and that's spot on. So it's, for many people, it will be a symbolic thing. So it'll be, we are saying within this business and recognizing that for small businesses, this, building in those sorts of things can be a challenge, but saying actually this is a priority for us, not because we think, every staff member is going to need it on an annual basis, but it needs to be there for people that, when they need to take it. And domestic violence leave, I think, is something that is growing in popularity all over the world now. There's significant numbers of businesses of all types are starting to take this on. Of course, the piece that needs to sit around that is the awareness and the in larger businesses, for example, in some of the banks, is making sure that you've got the right kind of structures and systems so that if a staff member does need to disclose anything to their line manager, that they've got safety and confidentiality around that. The other piece I think that's really interesting that that business is starting to take on is also how do we deal with perpetrators? How do we deal with people who are using violence in workplaces? Because just as we recognise that 1 in 4 women is impacted by this in her adult lifetime, we know that significant numbers of men are turning up to work every day, sometimes using workplace resources to actually further that abuse. And often you'll see some of those sorts of behaviours that might belie that they have those underlying attitudes about women, about gender equality. Certainly some of the stuff we've seen in the sexual harassment place and Kate Jenkins' Respect at Work report a couple of years ago. I think it all kind of ties in and is part of the conversation that we're having now.
And is that, excuse my ignorance, is that just noticing language, commentary, off-the-cuff comments, behaving in a way that is disrespectful to people and calling that out. Is that quite simply what we're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. And recognizing that, if you walk into a meeting and there is, and it usually is a guy, let's face it, a man who continually talks over women, who regurgitates her ideas and brands them as his own, who is constantly telling jokes that are a bit off, they're a bit sexist, racist, those sorts of stereotyped things, recognizing that the people in that room who don't have the power are probably the least comfortable and the least equipped to be able to call that out. So again, it comes back to that kind of bystander piece of, how can those of us who are in the room and who have a bit more of a voice, how can we challenge that stuff and say, actually, that's not, the behavior that we want. And do you realize that you just spoke over her? And I think most businesses and companies now have a reasonable set of structures and processes around that internally.
This topic, I could talk to you for so long about this, because as you're talking, I'm thinking about sort of all of the differing intersecting components to this as financial advisors, as sometimes business owners, as employees or employers, as parents, children, friends, siblings. This does pervade every area of our life. And I really feel that whilst this is a complicated, challenging and difficult conversation, it cannot be something that we push to the side to deal with later when we have time, effort, energy and resources, because that just isn't acceptable. And it's so evident that the community and our expectations as members of the community have been shifting for a very long time, but the vocalization of that has definitely been louder and stronger, I think, in the last few years, particularly younger women saying like, no more, and we're not putting up with this. And, without wanting to be overly crass, like I think financial advisors have to recognize that even if your member base is old, wealthy white men, their children are going to inherit their money soon, and they will not want to work with people that don't care about this stuff. And so the idea that this is someone else's problem, that I've got too many regulatory issues or, business considerations, it just can't happen. We have to hold space for thinking about what can we do? Not that we can be heroes and fix everything, and it's great to hear that there's some fantastic resources, but I just feel like the time is now to be having specifically financial abuse conversations, because as I said, I felt like for the longest time this hadn't been something that I had learnt very much about, and I do feel we're in a privileged position to educate Australians that financial abuse is a thing, that it is real, that it clearly impacts a lot of people, and I look forward to reading that Deloitte report, and that we can potentially help people learn the red flags as well.
And to be part of that that prevention piece of, let's shift it for the next generation, because I firmly believe that in a generation's time, we now know, things like the Deloitte report that came out yesterday, we have such a sense of the prevalence and the impacts of this violence, right? So a generation ago, we didn't have all the information. We didn't know how bad it was, who was being impacted, what those impacts looked like over the course of a lifetime. We didn't know that the experiences of women were so much worse than men, or when we did know it, we just didn't talk about it. It was just accepted. We know now. We know what this is doing to children and young people who are growing up in violence in households. We know what the impacts will be if they don't get the right kind of support and responses on the other side of this. So I firmly believe that if we don't fix it now, and if we don't, use the information that we have now and the breadth of knowledge that we have now about the size of the problem or what we need to do to fix it, then in a generation's time, they'll be coming back to us saying, you were negligent. You knew the size of the problem and you chose to do nothing about it because it was an uncomfortable thing to talk about, or, it was difficult to challenge because it was something that was going on in your immediate family. Yeah, and I understand why young women are so angry about this. I understand why older feminists are so angry about this, because they've been banging their heads up against the patriarchy for, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 years, and they haven't seen enough change happen yet.
Well, I'm delighted to have you to help us learn more about this uncomfortable but very real situation that is occurring. And I can't thank you enough for spending time teaching us and helping us identify it today. Can I change complete tact, because today has been quite heavy, but I do want to say thank you, because I know that your time is very precious and I'm delighted to have you. But I would love to round out today's conversations with a couple of rapid fire questions to you, if that's okay.
Go for it, Jess. Yep.
Okay. I want to know. So my podcast is all about how do we live great lives. And so I think today's conversation is about how we can help our clients live great lives. But this is sort of more holistic. So I want to know, what is one thing that you do to look after your mental health?
I have a bath every single morning before I start my day. I was born in England, and I'm very firmly English in my bathness. It's the thing that keeps me sane. So if I don't get my bath, it's not that my day falls apart, but there is definitely something missing.
That is the most exciting thing I have ever heard. As someone who is an aspirational bather, and I get like one a week, every morning just seems indulgent and amazing.
Every morning.
Congrats to you.
I mean, don't get me wrong, it's not a long bath. I have 2 small kids, so it's often like a kind of 2-minute soak, but it's my
counts.
time.
It totally counts. What would you say to younger Moo? What's one piece of advice you would give younger Moo?
Oh, gosh. Enjoy all the travel. Enjoy all of the moments, even the ones that feel really dark and intense and you're not sure where you're going next. It definitely takes you on the journey to where you are right now.
Love that. One thing that is yet to be ticked off your bucket list?
Well, it's not yet to be ticked off, but I want to go back and live in Europe again sometime soon. I miss Spain very much. So maybe living on a Spanish island. There you go.
Oh, that would be amazing. I have a fake book club, which is just books that I read and then I give my opinions to the world. Do you have a book for me to add to my fake book club?
Oh, I do. If you have not read Chelsea Watergo's Another Day in the Colony, get it and read it. I very, very rarely get to read these days. I did a degree in literature and language, English, way back in my late teens, early 20s. And so we used to have to read about 14 or 15 books a week for university. Now that I have 2 small kids, I have no time for reading. But this is the first book that I actually got to sit, and I read it like voraciously over a couple of days. It's confronting, it's powerful, it's challenging, and it really explains how young Aboriginal feminists in Australia today fit within the whole, the society that we're living in here, but Black Lives Matter. It's wonderful. Chelsea Watergo, Dr. Chelsea Watergo.
Right now, adding to the list. Thank you very, very much. That is all. Moo, huge thank you again for your time today. Very, very much appreciated. And I will add the information about the new podcast and the Deloitte research into the show notes as well.
Brilliant.
So huge thank you.
Thank you. It was really lovely having a chat, Jess. Happy to come back anytime.
Thank you. We might take you up on that. Thanks, Moo.
No worries. Take care.